Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast, the podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life.
Happy birthday to you.
I'm your host, Netta Gorman, and welcome to the special 1-year anniversary/birthday edition of the Life After Sugar podcast, and I'm here with my special guest, Dan Grief, from the UK Low Carb podcast. We're going to be talking a little bit about the last year's highlights of the podcast, mine, but also his. And I found that just like with cutting sugar, making a podcast comes down to pretty much the same thing. In other words, just get started. I put off cutting sugar for the longest time, and I have to be honest with you, I put off making a podcast for the longest time too. So if there's anything that you can take away from this particular podcast episode, it's this. Just get started. You never know where it will lead, but I can tell you this, it's somewhere fantastic. Here's my chat with Dan.
Hello and welcome to UK Low Carb.
And welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast.
And we're doing a crossover together. Woohoo! And I should say this as well, by the way. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Anniversaire. However it goes in French, I don't know. But,
Yeah, it's not my birthday, but it's my podcast's first birthday. Can you believe it?
Well, it's a weird one because... Okay, I think there's a reason that you and I are doing this because we actually met through a Facebook group, didn't we, about podcasting? Yeah. And that must have been almost a year to the day, like early to mid-January-ish that we met because we were talking in there and you said, oh, I've got this podcast coming out. I think I had Gary Torbs coming on the show around that time. And we talk about that. And, of course, you knew him very well because of his links to sugar and keto. And then I was talking to you about setting up a podcast and what it's like. And I love the way you gave yourself a challenge. You said, I've set myself a challenge. It has to be published in January. Like come hell or high water, it will come out.
Yeah.
Can you just explain when it did come out? Because I love the fact that your dates and your cadence is based on the date that is released, right?
Yes. It was like I set myself this challenge and I'm not one to let myself down, as it were, and it's just something that made me accountable. So I was scrambling to get things ready for January because I said I'm going to get this podcast out before the end of January 2021. And then how things take much longer than you ever think they would, especially in the tech world, the online world.
Everything in life is like that. Everything takes longer than you think. Yeah.
Absolutely. So January comes along and then, I was starting my new semester at my teaching job and everything sort of conspired to make it more complicated than I'd ever thought possible. And it sort of the end of January was creeping along and I thought, I've got to do what I said I was going to do. In the end, 31st of January was a Sunday. I wasn't ready before then, but that Sunday I pressed publish. You
just had to go for it.
Because I said I would do it. So I did it. And it ended up being on a Sunday. So after that, it was like, well, I guess all my podcast episodes are going to be out on a Sunday now because I wanted to do it weekly. So that's how it, and I told you, didn't I? I made myself accountable, not just for myself, but to you. I said, it's going to come out before the end of January 2021.
Just out of interest, and of course, this is a hypothetical question, but how much longer would it have taken, do you think, if you hadn't set that deadline?
Oh, another year.
Yeah, easily, because it's not actually all about the amount of stuff you have to do tech wise or preparation wise. It's mental stuff. It's the mindset stuff you have to get over, and
Oh, yeah.
and how you build up the confidence just to take the plunge. In some ways, you never would talk yourself into it. Having a hard deadline is a case of that's it. It's happening. We're jumping.
Yes, absolutely. It's like, just do it. Just press
Yeah.
the button. Just do it.
Any of the best friendships I have taken time. And so the podcast is that intimate experience of listening to somebody speaking, and you kind of feel like you're getting to know the podcast host, and you're getting to know the guests through that person, and they become a type of friend to you. And I really feel that way about the podcasts I listen to. I mean, I'm lucky because I know you a bit more than I would do if I just listened only.
Right.
But it takes time, and I think that's why listenership grows gradually and relationships grow gradually, because it is about a relationship. It's about that connection with someone, and you can't rush that. You just have to keep going and
Right.
steadily, slowly build up the audience, build up the narrative that you want to build.
Yes, totally. Yes. And be yourself, I would say, just carry on being yourself and sort of not apologizing about it to
Yeah.
anyone. And I've had people write to me over the last year, to say they take me along with them on their walks, which is lovely, that they listen to my podcast when they're washing the dishes or when whatever, you can multitask when it's a podcast. And a funny story, one time, more than one time during the last year, my husband does all the handiwork in the house, and I wanted to tell him something at one point, and I could hear that he was listening to, something. I thought it was the radio. I mean, he's French speaking, so I realized that after a minute that it wasn't the radio, because it wasn't in French, it was in English. And I was like, well, and I sort of tapped him on the shoulder and I said, look, I just want to talk to you for a minute. And so I interrupted him listening to me on the podcast
Talk to him.
to talk to him. He stopped me in
That's so
stereo.
old hat, man. That was last night. Come on, I've got to tell you a story about the housework. Yeah, sort the shelf out. I love it.
But
Just
it's
out of
nice.
interest, I just realised, because you are a fluent French speaker,
Yeah.
do you think you'd ever bring out a French podcast alongside your podcast? Is there a big enough French market, like
Not
audience
really.
out
I
there?
mean, I just closed down my French website, actually. I kept my membership in French, but I closed down the website and my blog in French. Not necessarily because there isn't enough of an audience or whatever, but just because I can't do everything twice over, or
Yeah,
rather, I don't want to. It requires too much brain space from me and so I just rather concentrate. First of all, English is my first language, so it's easier in that sense, although I am fluent in French. But it's just that if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it all in, and I can't spread myself too thin with two
yeah.
languages. Yeah.
I think also I can imagine you get to the stage where you think, have I said this before? Was it on this show? I've already said this thing, or did I say it in the other show? Because you want to be spontaneous and natural, and not feel like you're just doing the script that you've said it once naturally, and now you're just repeating it. That's
Right.
always a bit tricky, isn't it?
But although I
Yeah.
do have listeners that are French speaking, and I am an English teacher, for French speakers, English is a second language in my teaching job. So it's like some of the French speakers that listen to my podcast tell me they're getting a 2-for-1 because they're getting a free English class at the same time.
Love it, love it.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I was going to come on to in a moment, your highlights of your year, really, if you could share your first year in podcasting. And actually, I do this as well. I do a show in March when it's the anniversary of my show, and second anniversary this year, actually. And I do it with Nicola Howard, who's my first ever guest I had on the podcast. And actually, I was going to say your first podcast episode I thought was really powerful, because you had this lady who was talking, who was just like flipping amazing.
Yes, Shelley Varela is an amazing woman who I met a couple of years ago. She's with Stu McLaren, did a podcast with his called It's a Tribe Thing. And I took one of her courses, online courses. And so I asked her if she would mind interviewing me for my first, there's a sort of like an example of how to do an interview, because I had no clue and she has a lot of clues. She was the one that did that first episode, and she knows how to interview people. As now we've developed, the knack of interviewing people over time. But in my first episode, of course, I didn't know what I was doing, but she did. So that helped a lot, and so and she was also really interested in dropping sugar, getting more energy, and all the rest of as you know, the benefits of dropping sugar. So that also kind of helped in the first episode.
Yeah, she's so powerful, and
Yeah.
I felt like you two had a real like chemistry as friends, which helped as well.
Yes.
So she really understood and got you. And then she described the way that food is presented in stores, shops in the UK, as being food, but in actual fact, there's a lot of stuff in there which is completely not food. It's just marketing, and that's it. I mean, the fact that, for instance, Richard Morris says this in the Keto Dudes, that a box of cereal is actually more expensive to make the packaging than it is the actual food contents inside. Then I
Yeah.
think that's a pretty big guarantee it's not really food. And that's what she was saying. And I think she made a really good point. So I
Yes.
was just going to ask you then, over this last year, would you mind sharing some highlights, things that have stood out for you? Because, I think this expression is used too much for my liking, but in this context, it does actually apply really well. It is a journey. And this year for you has been one heck of a journey. So I'd
Oh, yeah.
like to know if you wouldn't mind, like a few highlights, and then just to reflect on those. I think it'd be really interesting to hear.
Well, let's see now. Because it started out, this Life After Sugar podcast started out in the throes of COVID. You would have thought that it would be more difficult, but the beauty of the whole online world, and podcasting included, is that, whether or not there happens to be a pandemic doesn't really matter. Although what I found was that actually, I guess, people are more online, or are more used to now being online, or you could argue have more time even to listen to
Yeah.
podcasts than they did before. Although I used to listen to them when I was driving in my car, and I don't drive in my car as much anymore because I'm not going anywhere. But be that as it may, it seemed that to me that, first of all, there's no good time or bad time to start a podcast. And I would venture to say the same for stopping sugar, just to plug
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
There is
Good.
no good or bad
Good
time.
point.
Just get it done, like we were saying at the beginning, just do it, start. So in that sense, that was a highlight, was just getting started, doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Another highlight, I would say, just generally, was all the people that I met doing this podcast. My first plan was to do alternating one week a solo episode and another week with a guest. And what ended up happening was that lasted for about 2 months, if that, because then I got so inspired getting in touch with people, asking them to be guests, that it ended up, my solo episodes ended up getting the boot. It was like other people, not necessarily more interesting than I am, but it's just so wonderful to have I had all these people lined up and episodes recorded. I still do. I've got a dozen.
Well, I think the thing with that is, even if it's, I mean, all of my shows are with somebody else, apart from actually the one that came out on a Tuesday the other day. But apart from that, they are always, this conversation, because you come across as equally as that person does in the conversation. It's not like you're just literally asking a question and then shutting up and then, and then just nodding and saying yes now and again. It's a proper conversation. And I think people, the best podcasts, in my opinion, are where you feel like a fly on the wall and you're just observing what's going on, and you feel like they don't even know they're being recorded. That's where it's really special, where they honestly are having a good conversation. It's really genuine. And that's why I think it probably brings out more in you to have somebody as well, because they bring out your character, your personality.
Exactly. Yes, you get to know someone through a podcast, and for me, I'll tell you a secret. I don't script any of it or plan any of it. We just wing it. And I
Yeah.
think that makes for the most authentic conversations.
Yeah.
And
No, I think it does.
yeah, and the few solo episodes I did do, I did plan them more, but then after that, I sort of just let go a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think but that's probably natural anyway. When you start anything new, you're always probably going to be more, um, well, I suppose, cautious, which is the word, isn't it? You're going to be more cautious about those things. But as you grow in confidence, you don't need it so much, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's
Um,
lovely. I'll
yeah.
tell you another highlight was having my dad on the podcast, but it was for a Father's Day episode, and I'm going to have my mum on for Mother's Day as well, the
Oh, how
British
lovely.
Mother's Day, yeah, which is in March, whereas American one is in May. But and funnily enough, that recording I did in I think it was about 3 years ago when he was visiting, and we recorded out in the street in some cafe in Montreal. So, and he's still alive. It's not like I couldn't have talked to him, but it was just such a spontaneous recording, he and I, that I wanted to include it in the podcast. I'm happy
That's
I did.
special. How
Yeah,
lovely. And it's
yeah,
also a way of like remembering and keeping that sort of special and protected forever, isn't it? It's just
yeah.
there then. How lovely. So he lives over here in the UK, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's in Cardiff. He used to live in Devon for about
Okay.
35 years, and now he lives in Cardiff.
Oh, okay. He's
Hmm.
becoming Welsh. Fair enough.
Yeah,
Lovely city, Cardiff. I love it down there. So,
yeah.
okay. Can you tell me then some of your other guests then? Some of the people you've met this year?
All right. So, the one other highlight, just before I tell you who I actually met for the first time, one other highlight was the interview with my daughter Lily, who was 12 at the time, almost 14 now. And then her friends listened to it, and she's been telling me, "Mummy, take it off. My friends think I sound like a baby."
Oh,
Oh, you're only 12 and now you're almost 14. Anyway, that was sweet. That is one of the most popular episodes, actually, an interview with Lily. Other people that I met for the first time, I mean, you obviously, one of the
yeah. You can't include me. That's really awkward, isn't it? Because I'm literally sat here facing you over. Okay, we've got the Atlantic between us,
got
but
that over with.
it feels a lot more intimate than that. So you can't mention me. That's just it's
Yeah,
just
I
rude
didn't. I
otherwise.
didn't mention you. Forget I ever
Move
said
on. Move on. Move on.
that. Now, I haven't. Just recently, I interviewed Dr. Jen Unwin, who I'm sure you know, and have you interviewed her for your podcast?
Yeah, I've interviewed.
Yeah,
She's my episode 3, I think. Yeah, very early
yeah.
days. Yeah.
So that was, a sort of a highlight. She's one of the sort of more well-known people that I interviewed, and I wasn't necessarily starstruck. I don't know if you've had this experience because you've interviewed way more sort of famous people than I have, and but they're just regular people.
Yeah, well, they're only famous in the low carb world, which is
Right.
helpful. I mean, if they were famous, like if it's Brad Pitt gone to keto, then maybe I would be a bit starstruck by that, because you'd know him more sort of famously. But I think these people, because they're only known to the keto, low carb, giving up sugar world, they are famous to us, but they're not hugely famous, which means that they are still themselves. They're just
Yeah,
normal people, which is lovely. Now, David and Jen Unwin in particular, I think are really down to earth people. There's also something which is really unifies a lot of these people, and that's that they have, and I think the common good is something you should talk a lot more about, but they have the common good interest of humanity at their core. And now that sounds a little bit like highfalutin and over the top, but what I mean is, as a doctor and as a psychologist working together in a doctor's practice, they're just trying to help their patients. They're not trying to do some sort of big media career. They're not trying to get their names out there. They're just
right.
literally trying to help people day to day, like you and I, make healthy choices and be healthier. And I think people like that are really special because you think, yeah, you give so much to people, and that's why you are so lovely. You are
Yeah.
genuine people, and I think they're all like that. All these biggish stars are generally trying to help people, which says a lot about them, really.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, yes. And we're all, what I felt over the last year of making this podcast is we're all on the same side, as it were, and we're all on the same page. And so we're all working towards the same goal in different ways. So for me, I had people as much who are 100% vegan, 100% carnivore, keto, not keto, sort of regular, people that just happen to have cut down sugar, not necessarily 100%, they don't have to be like me. In fact, I tell people, please don't be like me. One is enough in this world. We can all be different. It's all different shades of life after sugar. And that, I think, is what makes it so inspiring because every story is different. Every story is inspiring, and you don't have to be sort of a health coach or even you're sort of health minded to to cut down sugar and to live the benefits of it. And I think that's what is helping a lot of people to think, well, if she can do it, if he can do it, and they're just regular people like me, so can I.
Yeah, exactly. Things happened and lives have changed. And
Amazing.
it made me just realize the power of podcasting. It's a privilege to have the conversation, it's a privilege to listen. When you realize you actually made a little connection which helped somebody, wow, is that worth it? And it makes all of it sort of make sense suddenly, like, oh, that's why I do this, because it does make a difference to somebody in that context. And that is and most of those differences we'll never see or hear about or know.
Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. You don't know the ripple effect that your podcast will have or any decision. And I would say again, I keep bringing this back to sugar as well. You don't know what it will do when you stop eating sugar, or at least reduce it. You have no clue. I had no clue, how it would make me feel or sort of what it would create. You just don't know. This is why I say you just do it, just start.
Yeah, but then I do remember you saying when you came on my podcast last year how you used to eat a lot of chocolate, didn't you? I think you remember you saying. And I don't know what it was like for you, but I think the thought of doing something like giving up chocolate is probably worse than actually doing it. Well, it's hard in the first instance if you do have a real problem with that food. I appreciate, and I'm not belittling how people feel. However, you do get past that phase, wherever that thing is, and you actually live without it and you're fine. I think,
Yeah.
but quite often it is the first step that's the hardest, and actually probably the second, third, fourth, fifth, when you're still craving it and you haven't had it, it's the hard part, isn't it?
Yeah.
However, there is life after sugar, as your podcast suggests.
Yes, there definitely is. I think it's the idea of the first step that is actually more difficult than the first step itself. It's, the things we tell ourselves, myself included, it's going to be tough, I'll never survive. What is life like without chocolate? It's not worth living. And all these things that we tell ourselves as sort of justifications for not taking action. And for me, it was like I was telling myself all these things, but the bottom line was, no pun intended, the bottom line was I was still constipated and suffering. And if I didn't change something, then nothing would change.
Yeah. And actually, I can't even imagine, because I do remember you saying on the podcast how it was days and days. I don't know if it got to weeks or not. I think if you did, you'd be in serious ill health. But it went a long time before you could go to the toilet. Now, that must be incredibly uncomfortable and just a horrible feeling.
Yeah, it's toxic to your body on all levels. Yes. And so, it was like once a week or something for weeks on end. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty miserable. So what other changes have happened to people you've spoken to? So we know your change.
Yeah.
I think quite often, unfortunately, the health space, if that's the right expression, the health industry focuses on weight and body fat. And actually, it's such a narrow aspect of health, isn't it? And as most of us know, that's also a symptom of an underlying metabolic syndrome anyway. But what sort of things, apart from weight loss, have you noticed in your people, in your guests that you come onto your podcast?
Yes, I would say it's more to do with personal development than it is to do with nutrition or weight, because what I found is that people have discovered what I call life after sugar. I just gave it a name, but and trademarked it.
Oh, have you? Have you actually trademarked it?
I
I
don't want
can't
anyone.
say I can't say life after sugar without paying something. Okay, hang on. I'll set up the card details and hit the button whenever I press it.
I'll send you the bill at the end of the podcast.
Oh, word. I've said it quite a lot. Whoops.
Now you can say it. You can say it. You just can't use it for your own business.
I won't.
You won't. But I mean, what I call life after sugar is what people have discovered, as I have myself, that there is not only another life when you cut out what you think is like the most pleasurable, fun things in your life, the food. But what you discover is not just that there is another way of eating, but that there's another you hidden behind all that sort of mindless eating, mindless snacking, dependency on types of foods for your comfort and reward and
Yeah.
stress management and soothing. It's like, for me at least, and I can tell you for my guests as well, but I'd rather talk just about me. I had to grow up. I had to
Okay.
grow up, become an adult, and deal with my emotions and my stress in a grown up way, which biscuits and chocolate and ice cream were sort of keeping me in that childish mentality of sort of, I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to smother it in chocolate.
Wow. That's incredibly powerful the way you say that. You don't give yourself any breaks there, do you? You just went straight for the, I have to grow up.
But I
Wow.
didn't realize I was doing it until I'd done it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Makes
It
sense.
was like I didn't set out to say, "Oh, I'm 45." That's how old I was when I first cut out sugar. Why don't I act like it? Not at all. I was in complete denial and in
Mm.
resisting, even admitting that I was acting a bit like a toddler. And you should know because you're just coming out of that.
I have a
It's
toddler. I
like,
should just say for her listeners, I have a toddler. So yeah, it is like that exactly. The
yeah,
tantrums, the wanting things, and when they
now
get their own way, stamping their feet. Yeah,
yes, and as I say, we do that way into adulthood. At least I used to. And a lot of my guests, even though they don't say it in those words, a lot of my guests discovered just new ways to deal with their emotions, to to love themselves in other ways than with refined sugar, which, when you think about it objectively, is you're sort of taking something that will cause metabolic havoc in your body, weight gain, inflammation, all those things, and you're taking that to make you feel better. It makes no sense because
yeah,
it's
it
not
doesn't.
about making sense anyway.
But I also think that as human beings, I think you've really tapped into something so important there. I think we make the error of thinking ourselves very rational. And so, I've heard this described like this before, and I was reading a really good psychological book, and it said, we think our minds are the Oval Office, when in actual fact, our minds are the press office. We're trying to post rationalize what we've already decided based on our emotions. And if we just think that our emotions can be let rampant to do what they want, like you just said there, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's where you get yourself in trouble. You can rationalize anything afterwards, but actually knowing how to manage yourself, I think that's the best way of saying it, and what works for you. So for me, for instance, environment is a huge one. If I change my food environment, I make life a lot easier, or I make it a lot harder for myself, depending which choice I make. That's a huge one. And if you're somebody who, I mean, I'm quite lucky that in terms of actual sugar, table sugar, whatever, sweet things. I don't have a sweet tooth, so I'm
Yeah,
generally okay around that stuff. But for me, it's things like savory pastries. If I had those in my house, I'm eating them. It's like it just happens. Now,
yeah,
of course, I can try to rationalize that I shouldn't eat it because of X, Y, Z. I can have a plan. Actually, one of the highlights for me was talking to somebody who came from the chimp management project, and he was talking about this, the chimp in our mind, the part of us that is a chimp compared to the human part of us, and how the chimp always wins. So you have to strategize and manage how you get past those moments. So environment is a huge part of that for me, and making sure I've got the environment around me. But even if it's not just, you can't always control your environment. We're not control freaks. We have to live in the real world. What other strategies do you have? Accountability, community, my wife and I really support each other through this because we're on the same journey together, and we've been through a heck of a few years of ups and downs, and we've helped each other through those times. So it's whatever works for you to make that as easy and as smooth as possible,
yeah.
and that'll be different for each person, won't it? It's not always the same.
It's not always the same. And I think you can't know ahead of time what it's going to be, because it's such a difficult thing to imagine. It's such a big change. It may be small habit changes, but they have this ripple effect. And you can't tell. I couldn't tell ahead of time what was going to happen, So, and I think we underestimate just how much changes when we drop sugar, amongst other things. And I've had people on my podcast talking about not just dropping sugar, but dropping flour as well, sweeteners, and then all the way to intermittent fasting. I'm very popular with the intermittent fasting community, which I'm happy about because, funnily enough, my personal experience was not start fasting and then drop sugar. It was drop sugar without knowing what I was letting myself in for in the slightest.
Yeah, yeah,
and then find out that I was hungry less often. And then, like 3 years later, realize, oh, this has a name and it's called fasting,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know? And so dropping sugar is what I found over the last year for the podcast. People who start intermittent fasting for weight loss, but especially the health benefits, um, they end up realizing, a lot of them, that their nemesis is sugar.
Hmm.
Because it makes fasting a lot more difficult because it stimulates ghrelin and hunger and all the rest of it and blocks leptin. And B, we have this, most of us, this unhealthy relationship with sugar. We want more and more and more. And the food industry knows this, obviously. And so even though a lot of approaches for intermittent fasting are eat whatever you want, that's the beauty. That's what attracts people to fasting, right? It's not what you eat, it's how often. But what they end up realizing, a lot of people, what you want, eat what you want. What I say is change what you want, and then
Hmm.
you can eat what you want. And if you carry on eating sugary foods or starchy foods, then probably fasting is going to be more difficult for you.
Oh, for sure. I think it's like building a foundation to a house there. So if you cut out sugar, like you said, because of the hormonal response, you won't feel as hungry, which
Yeah.
helps you then do the next phase. If you fancy skipping a meal, which becomes so easy, doesn't it? Like I skip my morning meal now, and I sometimes have breakfast on a Saturday just to eat with my family to show willing. So I'll have an omelette, and I'll think, "Oh, I'm really not hungry, actually. I don't need this because I'm so used to not having it. But if
Yeah.
I had a really sugary tomato sauce on my pasta meal the night before, which I don't have, I'd be starving the next morning, and I'd need to reach for the whatever the breakfast was.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't even call it skipping a meal because that starts in the paradigm that there are 3 meals a day. I don't know who invented that, but in the sense that I stepped out of 101 different paradigms over the last 6 years. And so when people ask me, do you fast? I say, no, I just eat when I'm hungry. You can call it whatever you like. They say, are you keto? No, I'm Netta. It's one of my podcast episodes. And and the other thing is, yeah, do you skip meals? No, I just eat when I'm hungry. And where is it written in stone that it has to be 3, 4, 5 times a day?
Well, it's funny you say that because I'm on the same page as you there, but it is weird how people freak out when they say you don't eat breakfast because again, I don't know where it comes from. I wouldn't be surprised actually if it comes from a marketing or like a food industry place. I don't know that for sure, but I
It
wouldn't be
does, it
surprised.
does.
It
Yeah,
does.
blame
Okay.
Kellogg. You can blame Kellogg.
Yeah. Yeah, for a lot of stuff to be fair. And I
Yes,
think I think you know what, this idea of the meal being the most important meal of the day is breakfast is a really damaging, harmful one because people believe that as scientific proof and fact. And I just say, well, yeah, I just do my breakfast at 3 in the afternoon. That's when I break my fast. I don't need to eat in the morning, so why would I? And it's weird. You couldn't imagine an animal, going about his business, stopping to have a big meal and then getting on with his business again. It would eat when it's
exactly.
hungry, depending on what its metabolism is, what its food is. If it's a cow, it'll be eating all the time. If it's a predator, it might be once every 48 hours. It's just
Absolutely.
completely dependent on his diet. It's a weird concept, isn't it?
It is, it is. And that is also sort of the highlight of the last year for me, is seeing just the whole wide range of what works for different people. So for me, it's even more sort of weird than this whole concept of, so many meals a day, is the whole concept of for everybody,
Yeah.
one size fits all. And so I mean, obviously I realized that we're all different before the podcast, but this podcast of mine has really brought it home that we are so different, all of us. And I remember when I was suffering from constipation, the doctors and everyone telling me, eat more fiber, eat more fiber. And it was the worst thing for me, made everything worse. So this is what you do when you have this problem, this is the solution, and it's good for everybody, is that it just doesn't hold for, there's how many billions of us on this planet? It can't all be the same for everyone. And I would even say that cutting sugar is good for most people, but even then it's not necessarily what every single person needs.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, but in all truth, I don't know what it's like in just the sort of cutting sugar world. But when it comes to the keto low carb world, there's this thing called the keto police. And I
Yeah.
think I'd define that as people who would say there are ways that you should do keto and low carb, and there's ways that you just shouldn't do low carb and keto. And I just find, I personally agree with what you just said there, that it's whatever works for the individual. And of course that changes. You might be, for instance, cutting sugar one day, you might be going low carb the next, you might be going back from low carb to trying something different. You could be doing lots of different things in that time. It's all about supporting individuals on what they want to do with their lives. And actually, we're all adults here. So what's the judgment about? But some people have made up for a lack of personality with a new way of eating and think that's the same thing, which is a bit sad, really. And I think you should support each other if you can, not judge or criticize.
Yes, yes. I think I think keto may be attractive for a certain type of personality, because I say that because it doesn't attract me because of my personality, sort of the opposite, the you've got to do it this way. I mean, I get that keto is
Oh,
in
the
a state of,
counting, the numbers,
yeah, the
yeah,
tracking, the counting. I mean,
calculation. Yeah,
yeah, biologically, your body will get into ketosis with under 20 grams of net carbs. That's sort of a biological fact, as it were.
yeah.
But here's the bottom line for me is I don't care whether I'm in ketosis or not. I don't care how many grams of carbs I eat. I don't even care whether or not, I don't even care what other people eat. I care how they feel.
Yeah,
You know?
I totally agree. So, just in the last part of today's reflection back on your year and the year for the podcast, what would you say would be, your plan for next year? Is it to carry on in the same vein, or do you have any big projects coming up?
For the podcast, I would say, carry on with what's working. It seems to be working and seems to be inspiring people to hear other people, regular people on the podcast. But I do have some more specialized guests lined up, like a functional doctor, for example, because functional medicine changed my life. And so that's coming up in the next few months. And then, as I say, my mum is going to be on the podcast. I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. So more of the same, unless people ask me to change it, it's like, don't quit when it's working. And I'm going to carry on with, I have a membership, the After Sugar Club. I have a course, a 6-week course that I bring out a few times a year, the Life After Sugar program. So I'm going to just try and reach more and more people and help more people. That's the plan. I'm also teaching still part-time. So
Yeah.
It's a lot on my plate.
Keeps you busy. Yeah.
Keeps me busy. Yeah.
I just think there's so much potential with podcasting that you could do in the future. And I think it'd be great to work together. So, who knows? Watch this space, everyone. Maybe we'll do something in the future together, linking up these, because they are very similar worlds. Carbohydrate is sugar in your body, and you might be giving up actual sugar, you might be, in this case, giving up starchy carbohydrate, which becomes sugar. There's so much connection there, so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. And it's great that we can do the audio for the podcast and the video for like YouTube and stuff. Is great.
You got options. Yeah, exactly. It's a wonderful age. In fact, we can now have our own channels. We can now have our own TV and radio shows. That's effectively what these are. Amazing. And it's really exciting that you can do it. So, well, thank you for joining me today, Netta. It's been really lovely catching up. And I'll hope you have a lovely, successful second year with the show. I know you will. And it just grows and grows and grows and grows.
Thanks, Dan. Smashing. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Well, thank you, Dan. And I can tell you that living a sugar-free lifestyle is one thing, but actually helping so many people is way beyond anything I could ever have imagined. I mean, the Life After Sugar podcast in its first year is heading towards 100,000 downloads. That means that it's been listened to almost 100,000 times. The podcast has dozens of 5-star ratings and lots of rave reviews, so I can see that it's really hitting a nerve, that it's really speaking to you. And from the messages I get, I know it's also helping people in ways that I would never have imagined. It's so gratifying to know that the podcast is making a positive impact on so many people. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast episode, it's down to one thing: just get started. Easier said than done? Well, it's no easier with a podcast than it is with dropping sugar, but I promise you, it makes all the difference to just get started. And if you need help to do that, that's what I'm here for. And as I repeat over and over in the podcast, I don't expect anyone to cut sugar, flour, and sweetness completely like I did. Good if you do, good if you don't. In fact, what I believe is really good for us is to find what suits us the most, and especially what suits us in a sustainable way, so that we don't keep falling off the wagon and caving into temptation and turning to sugar for our emotional soothing. Because I get it. I mean, I did that for over 4 decades, so I totally get what it's like. And now I've been living 6 years free from all that. And my deepest wish is to help you get there too. And that's why I created the 6-week Life After Sugar program, which I open a few times a year, and which offers you a fast-track way to get to that freedom from sugar and cravings and emotional need for comfort foods. And we also have our monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, which is always open. You can come join us for 1 month or 3 months, or like most people, for several months. Because this is a process. And real life carries on whether you eat sugar or not. So wouldn't it be great to have other tools than sugar that will make you actually feel better rather than making you feel worse in the long run? That's what freedom from sugar feels like. And just like with real life, you don't know what's round the corner. So it's a blessing to be in a group with other people who understand you and support you and encourage you in all your ups and downs, including myself, because I've been there. I've been living a sugar-free life since July 2015, and believe me, I've been through plenty of ups and downs. So in the After Sugar Club membership, we're all in this together, and we're all there to support each other and to support you. If you want to join us in either the After Sugar Club or the 6-week Life After Sugar program, just go to aftersugarclub.com and click on the program tab to put your name on the waitlist for the 6-week Life After Sugar program, or click on the green button Join the Club to join us in our monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, which is always open for you. And while you're there at aftersugarclub.com, surf around and make the most of all the free resources there to help you start cutting sugar, like the videos in the What to Eat tab and the free simple guide to getting more energy with less sugar. That's on aftersugarclub.com and click on Simple Guide. And you can also find Life After Sugar on Instagram at My Life After Sugar. That's where I post pictures of what I eat and what I do. You know, Instagram stuff, so that you can see that it's totally possible to live a fun and active life even when you don't eat sugar. And come over and say hi on the Life After Sugar Facebook page too. There's lots of good info there, as well as on the Life After Sugar YouTube channel, where there's a growing library of videos to inspire you wherever you are on your journey to cutting sugar and feeling better. And if you're enjoying this episode, please rate it and scroll down and leave me a review and let me know how it's helping you in your life after sugar. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you get a new episode every Sunday. Thank you for listening. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.